So good morning. I'm something like a chimeric because I'm both from Belgium and the Netherlands, but that's why Maastricht fits quite well. What I would like to discuss with you is another attempt that we have done to collaborate and to learn a little bit more about the variability in vancomycin clearances observed throughout the world, with the intent to end up with more individualized dosing potential. So this is a collaborative effort combining Rotterdam, Leuven, Leiden, and Coimbra and Lisbon, because pooling of data is another way to learn more about each other's practices. So this is perhaps a little bit a busy slide, but I'll walk you through. We have to realize if we give an antibiotic or any other drug, that's the clinical pharmacology. It's all about what to give, drug selection, when to give it. For infectious diseases, it's all about when do you give an antibiotic or when do you stop an antibiotic. And the final part is how, and this is where clinical pharmacology mainly jumps in, and it's all about dosing and dosing and time intervals. So in general, if you go for an early or an infectious disease, you will collect a blood culture, but at the moment that you make a decision, you don't have these results yet. So you will target your drug selection based on efficacy and safety, as also reflected, for instance, in the range study, where we took the decision to go for amoxiclav instead of a smaller spectrum. So it's empiric for both dose selection as well as the drug dosing, and then subsequently when you have cultures in, you can actually more focus on targeted treatment. And the same holds true for the dosing, because you start with an empiric decision. You give, for instance, in this example, vancomycin as you used to give in your unit, milligram per kilogram in a time interval. And once you have therapeutic drug monitoring, you're able to attain your target, to narrow more your target. And I think very important in neonates is because they change quite fast, that you have to also consider for prolonged treatments that you have to confirm that you remain on target. This is the concept behind. So if you subsequently try to see how does this fit with vancomycin, vancomycin is also a drug which is claimed to be mainly focused on area under the curve type of concept. So this is the drug target. For penicillins or beta-lactams, it's more at time above mg, or for aminoglycosides, it's the peak concentration. So this area under the curve is an important concept. And this makes our lives as clinicians a little bit difficult, because we cannot calculate easily area under the curve concepts. We like to take things easier. We generally will go for a trough level, which does not necessarily reflect, is a very robust reflection of area under the curve. But anyhow, this is how it works for vancomycin. And then the next step is you can do a lot of calculations, as we have done a few years ago, also in the same collaborative effort, but without data and indomethacin, and end up with a quite complex dosing regime. And this is another problem, because the more complex your dosing regime is, the more complex it is and the more easier it is to make dosing errors. And the second issue is that even at that time, the only thing that you do, physiologically it doesn't make sense to say this baby is 7 days old and tomorrow he's 8 days old. Something has changed. The change between day 6, 7, day 7, 8, 8, 9 will likely be not a jump. So you dichotomize or you subdivide patient categories while you actually have trying to focus on continuous changes over time. But the first point that I would like to make is that at least I assume that the most of us still use trough levels. Is correct? But the trough level is a problem. You can take, for instance, your trough level too soon. This is what we learned while I was still mainly working in Leuven, that we generally took our trough levels after 24 hours. And this is simply a prediction model on how vancomycin will behave over time without any changes in dosing. And actually we took it after 24 hours, and in general we also thought, we are too low. And we subsequently changed it. And our clinical practice said if we take the check after 48 hours, that actually we were too high. That's not rocket science. It simply has a reflection for the fact that at 24 hours this baby is actually not yet on steady state. And this explains why we suggest to go for loading doses, also for those who go for intermittent dosing, because then you end up more within target and actually are already on target much sooner. The second issue is that it's nice to go for trough levels, but there is some problem with it, because if we give the same, and this is the tricky thing of this slide, all these babies are treated with exactly the same 24-hour dose. But some of these children were treated every 24 hours, while others were treated every 6 hours. the same 24-hour dose. And what you can nicely see is that your trough level will depend on your dosing frequency, not only on the total dosing. And neither this is rocket science, because if you give it once a day, you will give much more time for the baby to go for a lower trough level compared to, for instance, a baby who is treated every 6 hours where the trough level is 14. So if you say we always aim for 10 to 15, actually we don't really know how extensive your exposure will be, because if you're on for 14 or to 10 to 15, that's okay if you go for an area under the curve of 400 and if you go for 4 times a day. But if you go at once a day, this same trough level will be 8. So it's sophisticated, but you have to realize that if you change your dosing regime, not your total 24-hour dose, but your frequency of dosing, that this will affect your trough level to aim for. So this becomes quite mathematically too difficult for neonatologists at 2 in the morning. But this is the concept behind. What we would like to have as neonatologists is try to get a dose right for the best guess possible to get started. It's empiric. We accept that we can either, these are way too small to be read, but these are the trough levels, these are the area on the curve, levels, so you aim for between 400 and 700. And you want actually to have the most of your best guess dosing from the beginning on target. And you subsequently will do TDM and adapt your doses if needed, and subsequently will do perhaps follow-up TDM in prolonged exposure cases to sustain your exposure. This is how it does. But this first step is actually an important one. It's the empiric decision. And it will depend is, do you use a dosing regime which is validated in cohort with similar characteristics? What has been suggested in NeoFax or whatever your booklet, does it reflect the patients in your unit? If you go for prophylactic ibuprofen, it's quite to be anticipated that your drug clearance will be different. If you use ibuprofen or indomethacin, it may be that this may largely affect your drug clearance or prenatal lung maturation or whatsoever. So it's sophisticated. And I will first show you the sophistication of the system and finally show you that there is also a solution for that. But if you want to understand the pharmacokinetics in neonates, it's not easy. That's why we like it. But lots of the different things will affect pharmacokinetics. It's from assays, co-medication, clinical characteristics of the babies, other type of co-medications, perhaps genetics and environment, and also protein binding. Last year we discussed on protein binding because that's another aspect. This area under the curve 400 has been validated in adults for Staph aureus pneumonia and is reflecting their total concentrations, not the free concentrations. Well, actually the free concentrations in neonate are quite significantly different because they have lower albumins, they have a much higher free concentration. But what we would like to focus on is ibuprofen compared to indomethacin. And this is what we try to address by pooling data. We all know that kidney function in a newborn is mainly driven by vasoactive aspects in the kidney. So this is a cartoon on the glomeruli. You have the afferent and efferent arterioli. If you give an ACE inhibitor, you should not try this at home. If you give an ACE inhibitor, then you will open up the efferent arterioli and the blood will shoot through the kidney and lose its effectiveness. And the afferent arterioli, it has to keep open, and one of the main drivers of this openness is prostaglandins. So whenever you give a prostaglandin inhibitor, be it indomethacin or be it ibuprofen, you will end up with a problem. And this is what has recently also again been shown, because we already know for quite some time that indomethacin is perceived to be somewhat more nephrotoxic and at the clinical use doses, if you consider oliguria or you consider creatinine. This is a recent paper in neonatology who actually did a control study, ibuprofen versus indomethacin, and also illustrated that urine output and serotonin was significantly different with, let's say, less renal function in those exposed to indomethacin compared to ibuprofen. So this is what stimulated us to get, oh sorry, I should try to get one back. This is what stimulated us to merge data, because we already had quite some data on vancomycin and ibuprofen data set, but we never used indomethacin. But there's always someone in the literature that you can find. And there was a group from Portugal who actually reported quite nicely on babies co-exposed to indomethacin, dose from 3 times 0.2 milligram per kilogram per day, and their clinical characteristics of the babies were quite similar to ours. So this is what we used, and this is what we came up with. This is in essence a quite visual presentation. This is vancomycin clearance. This is the body weight of the patient, and what you can see, I'm Dalton, but I think it's gray. Those are the cases not exposed to any indomethacin or any ibuprofen. And then the blue ones are the ones exposed to indomethacin, and green perhaps are exposed to ibuprofen. Is correct? No. Something like that, sorry. But what you could see actually is that ibuprofen has a reduction of about 12% in clearance, and indomethacin at these doses 50%. So this may explain actually differences in if some units say, well, we give this dose of vancomycin and it works in our hands. It could be that actually they are using other or have not fully considered the co-medications used. To further illustrate it, we modeled this for 3 different types of patients. A patient with 770 gram, 1050 and 2500 grams from 6, 9 and 12 days old. And this is what you can see. These are the areas under the curve targeted, and the target should be somewhere around 400 with safety limits above and below, somewhat adapted because of protein binding. And what you can see actually between both aspects is that if you would use our initial dosing regime in patients exposed to indomethacin, that quite a significant number of these cases actually will be exposed to too high area under the curves and may end up with toxicity. So that's why we actually further adapted the dosing regime to end up with areas under the curve which are rather similar than those we initially modeled for babies either are not exposed to ibuprofen. And these different colors do reflect the different patients. So we end up with an even more sophisticated dosing regime with different loading doses, different maintenance doses. So this is way too difficult to really have in the top of your head when prescribing. So how can we achieve this? By collaborating again. Because you can actually use mathematical prediction type of models, online tools, to use them. So go and talk to your pharmacist. And this is just one illustration. This is dose up. I think it's from Estonian origin. But this type of models become more and more used, where actually all the mathematical calculations which have initially been published in papers are actually provided online as a back office. And then you can put in your clinical characteristics of your patients with your trough level, and then the computer will actually explain how you have to adapt your dosing regime to end up with the best exposure. So my 2 messages is yes, vancomycin targeted exposure is becoming more and more sophisticated. Sorry to say, but the good news is if you use the appropriate tools and you end up with collaborations, you can actually use the knowledge of hospital pharmacists to get better on target. And having said that, I'm happy to take any questions.